Berlin, July 20th, 1944. The Reich Chancellery stands shrouded in smoke and chaos. A bomb has detonated inside the Lair, Hitler's eastern command post, and across the Nazi Empire, a carefully orchestrated conspiracy begins to unfold. Operation Valkyrie, the most ambitious assassination attempt against Adolf Hitler, has been set into motion. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators believe the Führer is dead. They believe the moment has come to seize control of Germany, to negotiate peace with the Allies, to salvage what remains of a nation drowning in blood and ash. But history hinges not on grand plans alone. It pivots on individual choices, on moments of loyalty and doubt, on men who stand at crossroads and choose their path. And on that summer night in Berlin, one man would make a choice that would seal the fate of millions. His name was Otto Ernst Remer, a major in the Wehrmacht, commander of the Grossdeutschland Guard Battalion, a soldier decorated for valor on the Eastern Front. He was not a member of the inner circle of power. He was not a Nazi ideologue burning with fanatical zeal. He was, by most accounts, a professional soldier, competent, obedient, and unremarkable in the grand theater of the Third Reich. Yet when the conspirators needed the military forces in Berlin neutralized, when they needed the government quarters secured, when they needed Operation Valkyrie to succeed, Otto Remer became the obstacle they could not overcome. He became the man who stopped history from turning. To understand Remer's role in July 20th, we must first understand the world he inhabited, a world of collapsing certainties, of desperate gambits, of men grappling with loyalty to an increasingly deranged regime. By the summer of 1944, Nazi Germany was hemorrhaging. The Eastern Front had become a meat grinder, consuming entire divisions in the frozen wastes of Russia. The Western Allies had landed in Normandy, tearing through the Atlantic Wall, pushing relentlessly toward the heartland of the Reich. German cities lay in ruins beneath Allied bombers. The war was lost. Any rational assessment of the strategic situation made this undeniable. Yet the machinery of the Nazi state ground on, propelled by terror, ideology, and the iron grip of a dictator who refused to acknowledge reality. Within the officer corps of the Wehrmacht, a faction had been quietly planning. These were not communists or foreign agents. They were conservative aristocrats, career officers, men who had initially supported Hitler's rise, who had celebrated the remilitarization of Germany, the conquest of Europe. But they had watched in horror as the regime's brutality escalated, as the SS death squads followed the Wehrmacht into the east, as millions were systematically murdered. They had seen the military prestige of Germany ground into dust by Hitler's strategic incompetence, his refusal to retreat, his insistence on holding every inch of ground regardless of casualties. These men, Stauffenberg, General Ludwig Beck, Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, and dozens of others, concluded that Hitler had to die, that Germany had to be saved from itself, even if salvation meant betraying the oath they had sworn to the Führer. Operation Valkyrie was ingenious in its design. The conspirators would use an existing contingency plan, originally created to suppress potential uprisings by forced laborers or SS units, to seize control of Berlin immediately after Hitler's assassination. Key government buildings would be occupied, communication networks controlled, Nazi leadership arrested. The Wehrmacht would reassert control over the German state, sideline the SS, and negotiate an end to the war. It was audacious, intricate, and dependent on precise timing, and it required the cooperation or neutralization of units stationed in Berlin, units like the Grossdeutschland Guard Battalion, commanded by Major Otto Remer. Remer was 32 years old in July 1944. He had been forged in the crucible of the Eastern Front, where he had earned a reputation for tactical skill and courage under fire. He had been wounded multiple times, decorated with the Knight's Cross, and promoted rapidly through the ranks. His battalion was elite, well-trained, well-equipped, and stationed in the heart of the Reich capital to provide security for government institutions. On paper, he was exactly the kind of officer the conspirators needed: professional, efficient, capable of executing orders without question. What they failed to account for was the depth of his loyalty, not to the abstract idea of Germany, but to Adolf Hitler personally. When the bomb exploded at the Lair, Stauffenberg immediately flew back to Berlin, believing Hitler was dead. The conspirators activated Valkyrie. Orders went out across the Wehrmacht command structure. The SS had attempted a coup. The Führer was dead. The army must secure the government quarter and restore order. General Friedrich Olbricht, one of the conspiracy's key figures in Berlin, contacted Major Remer directly. He ordered him to seal off the government district, to arrest Nazi leadership, including propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, whose ministry was located in the center of Berlin. Remer received his orders and began moving his troops into position. The conspiracy was unfolding exactly as planned. But Remer hesitated. Something about the orders troubled him. Perhaps it was the confusion in the chain of command, the contradictory reports filtering through military channels. Perhaps it was instinct, the battlefield awareness that had kept him alive through countless engagements in Russia. Or perhaps it was simply the fact that he could not reconcile these extraordinary commands with his understanding of military protocol and loyalty. Instead of immediately executing his orders, Remer decided to seek clarification. He went directly to the propaganda ministry, to the office of Joseph Goebbels himself, the man he had been ordered to arrest. This single decision would change everything. Goebbels, one of Hitler's most cunning and ruthless lieutenants, immediately recognized the crisis and the opportunity. He was trapped in his ministry, surrounded by Remer's troops, aware that a coup was underway, but uncertain of its scope or success. When Remer arrived, Goebbels did not panic. He did not plead or threaten. Instead, he made a calculated gamble. He picked up the telephone and placed a call to the Wolfslair in East Prussia, and then he handed the receiver to Otto Remer. On the other end of the line was Adolf Hitler, alive, injured but functional, and seething with rage. The Führer spoke directly to the young major. He confirmed his survival. He denounced the conspiracy as treason. He promoted Remer on the spot to colonel and placed him in direct command of suppressing the coup in Berlin. Remer, hearing the unmistakable voice of his Führer, felt the universe snap back into alignment. His doubts evaporated. His orders became crystal clear. He would not arrest Goebbels. He would arrest the conspirators. Operation Valkyrie would not succeed. History would not turn.
The telephone call lasted only minutes, but it contained within it the entire psychological architecture of the Third Reich, the cult of personality, the chains of obedience, the visceral power of Hitler's voice cutting through confusion and doubt. For Otto Remer, hearing the Führer speak was not merely receiving new orders. It was a restoration of cosmic order, a reaffirmation of the oath he had sworn, a clarification of reality itself. In that moment, the complexities of military ethics, the strategic catastrophe engulfing Germany, the moral abyss of the Nazi regime, all of it dissolved into a single burning imperative: loyalty to Hitler. And with that loyalty secured, Goebbels and Remer would transform a collapsing conspiracy into a night of brutal retribution. Remer's decision was not unique in the annals of authoritarian systems. Throughout history, regimes built on personality cults have depended on men exactly like him, competent professionals whose loyalty transcends rational calculation, who can flake obedience to a leader with duty to the nation, who cannot or will not distinguish between the two. The Nazi state had spent over a decade cultivating this mindset, weaving Hitler's image into every aspect of German military and civilian life. Soldiers did not swear an oath to Germany or to the Constitution. They swore a personal oath to Adolf Hitler. I swear by God this sacred oath that I shall render unconditional obedience to Adolf Hitler, the Führer of the German Reich and people, supreme commander of the armed forces, and that I shall at all times be ready as a brave soldier to give my life for this oath. These were not empty words. For men like Remer, raised in the traditions of Prussian military discipline and indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, the oath was absolute. Breaking it was unthinkable, a violation not just of duty but identity itself. What makes Remer's role particularly significant is the timing and context of his decision. By July 1944, the evidence of Germany's impending defeat was overwhelming. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Red Army was advancing toward the Reich's borders, driven by rage and the desire for vengeance. In the West, American and British forces were breaking out of Normandy, beginning the liberation of France. The Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies. German cities were being reduced to rubble by round-the-clock bombing campaigns. Any officer with strategic awareness could see that the war was lost, that continuing to fight would only multiply German casualties and devastation. The conspirators who planned Operation Valkyrie were motivated, at least in part, by a desire to end this suffering, to salvage what remained of Germany before it was utterly destroyed. But Remer did not think in these terms, or if he did, such considerations were subordinate to his conception of duty and honor. For soldiers shaped by the Prussian tradition, obedience and loyalty were paramount virtues. Questioning orders, breaking oaths, betraying superiors, these were the ultimate disgraces, worse than death. The conspirators were asking Remer to violate everything he had been trained to hold sacred. They were asking him to judge his supreme commander, to participate in regicide, to become a traitor. And regardless of the strategic or moral arguments in favor of the coup,
Remer could not cross that threshold. His identity as a soldier, his sense of self, his entire worldview depended on maintaining his loyalty. When Hitler's voice came through the telephone, it was not a surprise or a revelation. It was a relief, a confirmation that the world still made sense, that the hierarchy remained intact. After receiving his new orders directly from Hitler, Remer moved with decisive speed. He redeployed his troops throughout the government quarter, not to secure it against the SS, but to suppress the coup. He placed guards around the Bendler block, the Wehrmacht headquarters where the conspirators were coordinating the operation. He established checkpoints, cut off communication lines, and began systematically dismantling the conspiracy's control over Berlin. Within hours, the momentum of Operation Valkyrie reversed completely. Officers who had initially obeyed the conspirators' orders now hesitated, confused by the contradictory commands flooding the military communications network. Word spread that Hitler was alive, that the coup was treasonous, that anyone participating would be considered a traitor to the Reich. Inside the Bendler block, the conspirators realized their plan was collapsing. Stauffenberg, who had flown back from the Wolfslair still believing he had killed Hitler, found himself trapped in a building surrounded by hostile forces. The officer corps, which the conspirators had hoped would rally to their cause once Hitler was dead, instead remained paralyzed or hostile. Some officers who had been sympathetic to the conspiracy withdrew their support once they learned Hitler had survived. Others who had never been part of the plot now moved to suppress it, eager to demonstrate their loyalty and save themselves from suspicion. The telephone call between Hitler and Remer had not just stopped one major from arresting Goebbels, it had shattered the entire psychological foundation of the coup. If Hitler was alive, then Operation Valkyrie was not the restoration of order, but an act of treason. And in Nazi Germany, treason meant death. By midnight, the conspiracy was effectively over. Loyal Wehrmacht officers inside the Bendler block, led by General Friedrich Fromm, who had been aware of the plot but had tried to remain neutral, moved to arrest the conspirators. In a desperate attempt to distance himself from the coup and prove his loyalty, Fromm convened an immediate court-martial. Stauffenberg, Ulbricht, and 2 other officers were convicted of treason on the spot and executed by firing squad in the courtyard of the Bendler block, illuminated by headlights of military vehicles. Stauffenberg's last words, shouted before the bullets tore into him, were "Long live sacred Germany." But sacred Germany, in that moment, belonged to Hitler, and Hitler was alive. Remer's role did not end with the suppression of the coup. Over the following days and weeks, he became a key figure in the Nazi regime's brutal response to Operation Valkyrie. The conspiracy had involved hundreds of people: military officers, civil servants, aristocrats, clergy, intellectuals. Hitler, enraged and paranoid, demanded comprehensive revenge. The Gestapo launched a massive investigation, arresting anyone with even tangential connections to the plot. Show trials were organized, presided over Roland Friesler, the fanatical president of the People's Court, who screamed abuse at defendants and ensured guilty verdicts. The executions were designed to be as humiliating and painful as possible. Conspirators were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, their deaths filmed on Hitler's order so he could watch them die slowly, strangling and thrashing. Approximately 5,000 people were arrested in connection with the plot. Around 200 were executed. Entire families were destroyed under the principle of Sippenhaft, blood guilt, which held that the relatives of traitors shared their guilt and must be punished. Remer, meanwhile, was celebrated as a hero of the Reich. Hitler publicly praised him, promoted him again, and awarded him the German Cross in gold. He became a symbol of loyalty in a regime increasingly paranoid about betrayal. His decisiveness on July 20th was held up as a model of proper National Socialist soldierly virtue. He was given command of the Führer Begilte Brigade, an elite unit assigned to protect Hitler personally. For Remer, the rewards of loyalty were immediate and tangible. He had made the right choice, at least according to the value system of the regime he served. But what does it mean to make the right choice in a fundamentally evil system? This is the question that haunts Remer's story. He was not a mindless fanatic. He was an intelligent, capable officer who understood military strategy and tactics. Yet when confronted with a decision that could have changed the course of the war, could have saved countless lives, could have spared Germany the final 9 months of devastation that followed, he chose obedience over judgment, loyalty over morality, the oath over the nation. His choice was consistent with his training, his worldview, his identity as a soldier. But it was also a choice that prolonged the war, that ensured the continued functioning of the Nazi death machine, that contributed to the deaths of millions in the final spasm of the Third Reich's collapse.
The months following July 20th revealed the full dimensions of Otto Remer's commitment to the Nazi cause. He was not merely a soldier following orders. He was a true believer, a man who had internalized the regime's ideology so completely that his personal identity had become inseparable from its survival. As Germany descended into its final agony, as the Reich crumbled under the combined weight of Soviet vengeance and Allied firepower, Remer remained steadfast. He commanded his Führer-Begleitbrigade with the same tactical competence he had displayed throughout the war, fighting desperately to defend a regime that had already lost any claim to legitimacy, if it had ever possessed one. His story in these final months illuminates a disturbing truth about authoritarian systems. They do not require masses of sadistic monsters to function. They require competent professionals who choose not to see, who subordinate moral judgment to institutional loyalty, who mistake obedience for honor. After his promotion and transfer to the Führer-Begleitbrigade, Remer found himself at the epicenter of the Third Reich's death throes. His unit was designated as one of the Reich's elite formations, tasked with defending critical positions and ultimately protecting Hitler himself as the Allied armies closed in from all directions. The Eastern Front had collapsed entirely by early 1945. Soviet forces had swept through Poland and were hammering toward Berlin, leaving a trail of devastation and retribution in their wake. In the West, American and British armies had crossed the Rhine and were driving deep into Germany's industrial heartland. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel. German cities were wastelands. Millions of refugees fled westward, desperate to escape the Soviet advance. And yet the Nazi leadership, Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, and the Inner Circle, refused to surrender, refused even to acknowledge the reality of defeat. Remer participated in several of the final desperate battles of the war. His brigade fought in the Ardennes offensive in December 1945, Hitler's last major gamble in the West, an attempt to split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. The offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, was a tactical surprise that achieved initial success before collapsing under the weight of Allied material superiority and German logistical inadequacy. Remer's unit performed competently, demonstrating the fighting quality that had made the Wehrmacht so formidable even in defeat. But competence could not overcome arithmetic. Germany was being ground down by enemies with vastly greater industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and strategic reach. Every German soldier killed could not be replaced. Every tank destroyed, every aircraft shot down, every gallon of fuel consumed brought the Reich closer to extinction. What is most striking about Remer's conduct during this period is his apparent lack of doubt. While other senior officers began to privately question the sanity of continuing the war, while some sought ways to negotiate local surrenders or make contact with the Allies, Remer remained committed. He did not plot, did not waver, did not consider alternatives. This was not simply fear of punishment, though the aftermath of July 20th had certainly demonstrated what happened to officers suspected of disloyalty. It was genuine conviction. Remer believed in Hitler, believed in the mission, believed that loyalty and obedience were virtues that transcended strategic circumstances. This made him extraordinarily useful to the regime in its final months, but it also made him complicit in prolonging a war that served no purpose except the satisfaction of Hitler's apocalyptic fantasies. The psychology of men like Remer presents a profound challenge to comfortable narratives about totalitarianism. It is tempting to imagine that authoritarian regimes are sustained primarily by fear, that most people are secretly opposed, waiting for the opportunity to resist, and that only terror keeps them in line. The reality is far more disturbing. Many people genuinely believe. They internalize the regime's values. They find meaning and identity in their service to it. They experience loyalty as a form of transcendence. Remer was not tortured into obedience. He was not coerced or blackmailed. He chose his path freely, and he chose it repeatedly, even as the consequences of that choice became increasingly catastrophic. This phenomenon, the competent professional who serves evil efficiently, is central to understanding how totalitarian systems function. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, developed in her analysis of Adolf Eichmann's trial, captures something essential about figures like Remer. They are not demonic masterminds or sadistic psychopaths. They are ordinary people who have made extraordinary moral compromises, who have surrendered their capacity for independent ethical judgment in exchange for the psychological comfort of obedience and belonging. They do their jobs well. They take pride in their professionalism. They measure their success by institutional standards, efficiency, loyalty, competence, rather than by moral criteria. And in doing so, they become the infrastructure of atrocity. As the Soviet armies closed in on Berlin in April 1945, Remer's brigade was deployed to defend the approaches to the city. The battle for Berlin was not a military operation in any conventional sense. It was a massacre, a final spasm of violence that served no strategic purpose. Hitler was determined to fight to the last man, to drag Germany down with him into death.
Goebbels, ever the propagandist, spoke of glorious last stands and historical vindication. The reality was chaos, terror, and pointless slaughter. German soldiers, many of them teenagers conscripted in the war's final months, were thrown against Soviet tank columns. Civilians huddled in basements as artillery fire reduced their city to rubble. SS squads roamed the streets, hanging anyone suspected of defeatism from lampposts with signs around their necks. I was too cowardly to defend the Reich. Remer fought in this nightmare until nearly the end. His brigade sustained heavy casualties but maintained its cohesion longer than most Wehrmacht formations, testament to his leadership abilities and the elite nature of his brigade. But even the most competent commander could not hold back the tide of Soviet armor and infantry pouring into Berlin from all directions. The Reich Chancellery, where Hitler had retreated to his bunker, was surrounded. The city was being conquered street by street, building by building. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his underground bunker, finally acknowledging the defeat he had refused to accept for so long. Goebbels followed him into death the next day, after murdering his own children. The Third Reich, which Hitler had boasted would last 1,000 years, had survived 12. Remer was not in Berlin when it fell. In the final chaotic days, his unit was cut off and forced to retreat westward. Unlike many Nazi officers who fought to the death or committed suicide, Remer chose to survive. He surrendered to American forces in early 1945, ending his war not with a dramatic last stand but with the pragmatic decision to become a prisoner of war rather than a corpse. This choice, to survive when the regime he had served so loyally was destroyed, would prove significant for his post-war trajectory. Otto Remer was not finished with history. He had merely entered a new phase. The immediate post-war period was chaotic. Germany was occupied, divided, and subjected to Allied denazification programs designed to purge Nazi ideology and punish war criminals. Remer was imprisoned but not prosecuted as a major war criminal. His role in stopping Operation Valkyrie, which the Allies initially viewed as a military matter rather than a political one, actually protected him from more severe consequences. The conspirators of July 20th were by 1945 regarded by many Allied officials as heroes who had tried to stop Hitler, but at the time of Remer's capture, the complexities of the coup were not fully understood. Remer was classified as a professional soldier rather than a political figure or SS officer, and after a period of imprisonment, he was released. What followed was perhaps even more disturbing than his wartime service. Remer did not undergo any moral reckoning, did not express remorse, did not acknowledge that his loyalty to Hitler had been misplaced. Instead, he became one of the most prominent neo-Nazi figures in post-war Germany. He founded and led far-right political organizations, denied the Holocaust, spread conspiracy theories, and explicitly defended his actions on July 20th. In speeches and writings, he portrayed himself as a hero who had prevented a betrayal of Germany, who had remained loyal when others had faltered.
Otto Remer's post-war life reveals a truth that many prefer to ignore. The collapse of a totalitarian regime does not automatically erase the beliefs that sustained it. Ideology, once internalized, becomes resistant to external refutation. For true believers like Remer, the defeat of Nazi Germany was not evidence that their cause was wrong. It was evidence of betrayal, of conspiracy, of historical injustice that needed correction. In the decades following 1945, as Germany struggled to rebuild and reckon with its past, Remer became a tireless advocate for Nazi rehabilitation, a propagandist for Holocaust denial, and a rallying point for extremists who refused to accept the moral verdict of history. His transformation from soldier to agitator demonstrates how authoritarian movements survive their own destruction, how they metastasize into underground networks and fringe movements, waiting for moments of social crisis to resurface. Upon his release from Allied custody in the late 1940s, Remer initially maintained a low profile. Post-war Germany was subject to strict denazification laws. Former Nazi officials were barred from public office, and expressions of Nazi ideology were criminalized. The Allied occupiers, particularly the Americans and British, were determined to prevent any resurgence of fascism. But denazification was always incomplete and inconsistent. The practical demands of rebuilding Germany, the onset of the Cold War, and the sheer scale of Nazi Party membership, millions of Germans had been affiliated with the regime, made comprehensive purging impossible. Many former Nazis quietly reintegrated into German society, changing their political affiliations, burying their pasts, and adapting to the new democratic order. Remer was not one of them. He remained ideologically committed to National Socialism and contemptuous of the post-war German state. By the early 1950s, he had emerged as a public figure in far-right politics. He joined and eventually led the Socialist Reich Party, Sozialistische Reichspartei, or SRP, a neo-Nazi organization that explicitly advocated for the restoration of nationalist authoritarian government. The SRP attracted former Wehrmacht officers, SS veterans, and German nationalists who felt betrayed by the post-war order. They rejected the narrative of German guilt for the war and the Holocaust. They portrayed Germany as a victim, occupied, divided, and humiliated by the victorious Allies. They argued that Hitler's crimes had been exaggerated or fabricated by Allied propaganda, that the real criminals were the conspirators of July 20th who had betrayed Germany in its hour of need. Remer became the public face of this revisionist narrative. In speeches and writings, he defended his actions on July 20th, 1944 with increasing vehemence. He argued that the conspirators had been traitors who had surrendered Germany to the Allies and communists who had dismembered the nation and destroyed its sovereignty. He portrayed himself as a patriot who had saved Germany from internal betrayal, who had remained loyal when cowardly aristocrats and defeatist generals had plotted to stab the nation in the back. This narrative resonated with certain segments of German society: veterans who could not reconcile their wartime service with the post-war narrative of German guilt, nationalists who resented occupation and division, extremists who had never abandoned Nazi ideology. The Socialist Reich Party grew rapidly in the early 1950s, achieving electoral success in several regional elections and alarming both German democratic politicians and Allied occupation authorities. The party's platform was overtly neo-Nazi. It rejected parliamentary democracy, advocated remilitarization and reunification under authoritarian leadership, and promoted anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Remer's personal charisma and his status as a decorated war hero gave the movement credibility among certain constituencies. For a moment, it seemed possible that a neo-Nazi party might become a significant force in post-war German politics. The West German government, still fragile and deeply concerned about its international legitimacy, moved decisively. In 1952, the Socialist Reich Party was banned by the Federal Constitutional Court as a threat to democratic order. This was one of the first major tests of Germany's post-war commitment to preventing fascist resurgence, and it established a precedent that would shape German politics for decades. The ban effectively destroyed the SRP as an organized political force, scattering its members and forcing its leadership underground or into exile. But it did not silence Otto Remer. He continued his political activities, operating through smaller organizations, publishing propaganda, and maintaining networks with international far-right movements. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Remer became increasingly involved in Holocaust denial. He publicly claimed that the systematic murder of 6 million Jews had never occurred, that it was a propaganda invention designed to justify Allied war crimes and extract reparations from Germany. This was not a fringe position within neo-Nazi circles. It was central to their revisionist project. Acknowledging the Holocaust made defending Nazi Germany morally impossible. Therefore, the Holocaust had to be denied, minimized, or rationalized. Remer embraced this position completely, writing articles, giving speeches, and participating in international conferences where Holocaust deniers gathered to share their pseudo-scholarship and coordinate their propaganda efforts. His activities eventually led to legal consequences. In 1992, Remer was convicted in Germany of inciting racial hatred and denying the Holocaust, crimes under German law. He was sentenced to 22 months imprisonment. Rather than serve his sentence, Remer fled Germany and lived in exile, first in Spain and later in other countries sympathetic to far-right fugitives. He continued his propaganda work from abroad, giving interviews, writing memoirs, and maintaining networks with neo-Nazi networks across Europe and beyond. He never expressed remorse for his role in Nazi Germany, never acknowledged moral responsibility for the consequences of his loyalty to Hitler, never conceded that the regime he had served was fundamentally evil. Remer died in 1997 in Spain, still defiant, still committed to the ideology that had defined his life. His funeral was attended by neo-Nazis from across Europe who celebrated him as a martyr and hero. In their narrative, he was a soldier who had remained loyal when others betrayed, a patriot who had defended truth against Allied propaganda, a victim of post-war persecution. This narrative ignores the essential fact that Remer's loyalty prolonged a genocidal regime, that his actions on July 20th ensured the continuation of the Holocaust in the war for another 9 months, that millions died because men like him chose obedience over judgment. The question that haunts Remer's story is not whether he was personally evil in some simplistic sense. It is whether he was morally responsible for the consequences of his choices. Remer would have argued that he was simply doing his duty, following his oath, acting with honor according to the codes he had been taught. But this defense, the defense of duty and obedience, has been rejected by every serious examination of Nazi crimes since Nuremberg. The principle established at those trials was clear: individuals are morally responsible for their actions, even when acting under orders. The law recognizes superior orders as a potential mitigating factor, but not as an absolute defense. Soldiers are human beings with moral agency, not machines that execute commands without judgment. Remer's post-war trajectory makes this moral failure even clearer. A person who made a tragic mistake under the pressures of war might be expected to reconsider, to express regret, to acknowledge the harm caused by their actions. Remer did the opposite. He doubled down, devoted his remaining decades to defending and promoting the ideology that had led to catastrophe. This suggests that his choice on July 20th was not a momentary error or a consequence of manipulation. It was an authentic expression of his deepest convictions, convictions he maintained until death. The man who stopped Operation Valkyrie was not a monster. He was an intelligent, competent professional who made choices that aligned with his training, his worldview, and his conception of honor. But those choices had catastrophic consequences. The war continued for 9 more months after July 20th, 1944. In that period, millions died, on battlefields, in concentration camps, in bombed cities, in the final chaotic violence of the Reich's collapse. The Holocaust continued, consuming hundreds of thousands more victims before the camps were finally liberated. Germany itself suffered devastation that might have been avoided if the coup had succeeded, and a new government had negotiated surrender.
We cannot know with certainty what would have happened if Remer had made a different choice. Alternate history is speculation, not analysis.